Hi everyone. In this video, we're going to start blocking in a few more of the fundamental details here and finding ways to make sure that we can speed up the process of doing that. So the first thing that I do want to point out is the proportions of this image are actually not quite right. I was starting to notice it before, but I wasn't quite sure. And so, for example, if we just look at our actual concept here, you can see it's not nearly as stretched out as this version is. So, of course, why did that happen? The goal here was to make sure that it's the exact same proportion. So, what went on? Well, the fact of the matter is, if we press F12, we'll get a quick little access to our scaling proportions. So, depending on which mode of transformation you're using, either transform movement, or transform rotation, or transform scale, we're going to end up with something that's going to show us what those numbers are. So, for example, any time that our scale is changing, it's going to show up in here. It should be 100, but in these cases, we're seeing that it isn't, and we did have this object scaled. So I could pull this up a little bit more just to make sure that that's correct. But now you can see this actually much more closely resembles our actual concept in terms of proportion. So that's what we actually want to make sure we're working with here, and this will give us something that's going to be a little bit more correct. And again, we can do the same here. I'm just going to set this to 200 on each one, and then we can still scale this up a little bit more. Now those are the appropriate size that they're supposed to be and the correct proportion. But again, that's not super important all the time. You always just need to make sure you're comparing with the concept, no matter where it is. Whether it's in Max or otherwise is somewhat irrelevant. So again, we're just going to check out our model here, but you were seeing before that I was pressing spacebar in this case to sort of see what my final result is with symmetry turned on. Now normally you've got to press this button, but I've set up some shortcut keys for myself. So if you haven't done that before, we just go to Customize, Customize User Interface, and when this opens up, it usually takes a moment for some reason, and we can start editing things in here. So what we can do is, for example, I edit a lot of things inside our poly tools. Now these ones I use a lot. They're mostly things that exist in the freeform area and inside some of the modeling area as well. These are mostly called poly tools, and there's a lot of them in here, and I have a lot set up, such as, for example, loop is set to control 1. I've got ring set up to control 2 so that I can do rings and loops very quickly. As well, remove loop is a single button where I can basically click a single edge, it'll do a loop, and then delete that loop right away, all with one single little click. My other favorite is my Swift Loop button, which is Shift S. I use that very frequently. And there's a number of them in here, and basically if you want to set one up, it's pretty easy. We can go to our let's go, for example, to our ribbon area here. I think in ribbon modeling, it's always a little tricky to find out where these shortcuts are that you're going to actually want. A lot of times you just kind of got to search through this. But for example, show end result exists in ribbon, and it should exist in some other areas as well. But show end result, you see I've got set to being spacebar. If you wanted to change it, just go to the hotkey area and you could press A or anything you want here. Space, for example, will show us what it's assigned to. And you could say remove, for example, or assign. If it's already assigned to something else, such as A, then when you assign it, it's going to start overwriting something else. Now, overrides active are still in here as well, so sometimes you want to turn that off. Usually it should give a warning in older versions especially, but in this version it doesn't look like it's doing that. So I'm just going to remove both of these. I'm going to press spacebar and say set. And I do want to make sure that my snaps are still turned on. So a lot of times you may want all commands, which will load up everything. And we can see here, and we can just kind of scroll on down. Your best bet is to kind of search for the setting that makes sense. Usually it's just named correctly, such as, for example, you'll see just angle snaps toggle. So you could start with angle under A. You can press A in here. And you could start just to kind of search through here and try to find angle snaps, which can just take a little while to do, but you'll see here, angle snap toggle. Usually works out pretty decently. Sometimes it might be under snap and then like comma angle toggle, so that can differ in some cases, but usually it's pretty easy to find in that case, at least if you're looking at all commands. Then we can just say A, you can see it's not assigned, and just fix that up. Now normally overrides should be called out in this case, but in this situation it wasn't. If you wanted to save this and use this somewhere else, then you can actually just save this as a file and put it onto other computers as well. And so that's how we do custom shortcut keys inside Max to make our modeling go a little bit faster. So for example, if I just press Shift S, I actually get Swift loops, which is incredibly useful for a number of things. I'm not going to use that just yet, but we'll see here. Now I can press spacebar and show the end result without having to go over here. Let's just pull this out a little bit more. I do want to fix these proportions just a little bit. Make sure that that looks pretty decent. And I think that that'll work out perfectly fine for me right now. Once those proportions are established, then I kind of don't want to change them too much. I just kind of want to work with what's there and keep it nice and clean. And now at this point, I can start modeling in some of these extra parts here. So for example, I'm going to hold Shift, just pull out this little section here. And now we can see here that this just goes a little bit too far, so we're going to pull that back in. Click this edge. I'm going to hold Control-Shift-C to get a quick access to my chamfer button and just kind of pull that out there. That's going to, just by default, take on the same angle as that edge and just kind of pull this in, push this in here, just so we're kind of blocking in some of these basic elements here. Now, just pull this over here, just so that these proportions go into the right location. There's supposed to be a bit of a gap here, and there's supposed to be a bit of an empty space towards the bottom. And I don't want to start blocking in any of these kind of details yet. It's not necessarily effective for me to do it, and it's going to just kind of waste my time and distract me a little bit. So let's just select this. I'm going to duplicate this out, pull this here. I'm not creating any kind of substantial shape to this just yet either. I don't really want to get too caught up in that just yet. I'm going to use my snaps to kind of pop this edge up, delete this, and I'm going to chamfer this again because I want a shorter chamfer, but I want to make sure that the angle stays the exact same as what we had before. Let's just pull that in a little bit more here as well, just to make sure that that's working out pretty decently. So that's all right. I do also want to just get rid of that material that exists and start using one that's a little bit more appropriate for this. Let's just grab not a shellac material. I want a standard, which has been moved inside 2017 into a scanline area. So we'll just pull this out here. Just delete that shellac accidental material. And just say assign material to selection, which will work a little bit better for me. So that's just fine. So now that I've got some of this blocked out, I'm just going to create a little bit more shape to these pieces by using one of the tools that I really like, one of these modifiers. So I'm just going to take these two pieces, detach them entirely, and I'm going to take my symmetry and I am going to copy it. That way, I can come over here and I can say paste instance or even just paste, and you'll see that it's going to paste in the exact same location, that symmetry modifier, regardless of where the pivot point is. Now I can also go in here and scroll on down to a feature I really like, the shell modifier. Shell modifier means I can just kind of create this big blocky shape here in whichever direction I want, and it'll build in that little block there for me. And this works really well. I can take this section now, duplicate it, rotate it. Let's just pull this out a little bit here. Make sure the angle's right. Pull it right here. And we can start to see very quickly the kind of block-ins that we want to actually work with. That'll work decently there. Pull that over to the side. Now again, if we look closely at the concept, there's a bit of a gap here where there's a little empty spot right there where I think I want to still maintain that and make sure that that stays the same. And just kind of eyeball some of this, and that'll work out pretty decently. Now, of course, again, with the shell, I can push this out quite a bit more, either going outside or inside this shape. I think either in this scenario is just fine. I do want to make sure that this has a nice blocky shape from above. That way that's going to look really good from further away, because all these details are going to need to be nice and big and blocky. Lastly, let's just take this section here. Let's use inset to kind of push that in a little bit. And let's use extrude to pull that out. And then let's just do a collapse operation on that as well as a little bit of a loop, a ring here. So again, I can press just Control-2, which will do a ring operation. Control-Shift-E will connect, and I can just kind of pull that edge out a little bit here. If any of those proportions are not quite right, I can just kind of scale this in a little bit more just to kind of get that proportion a little bit more correct for the way that this should look. And I recommend just kind of constantly coming back here to see how those proportions work. And I can see here already that this section's just a little bit too small for what it's supposed to be. Let's just scale that up a little bit more here. Scale it up a little bit more, just to make sure that that's going to look dominant on this object. And if that's the case, that's going to be good. So now all I need to do is just make sure I pull these edges out so that they leave nice little empty space right in between these two elements here. That'll work pretty decent. And already that's looking pretty close to what the concept's supposed to be. So for our next video, we're just going to dive into just a few more details to get the block in of this whole box ready to go.